Hello, my name is Erica Grimm and I am Professor of Art and Design at Trinity Western University. Today I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional, ancestral, unceded Stalo Tumuk, on the shared territories of the Kwantlen, Katzie, Matsqui, and Semiahmoo First Nations. For 40 years of making, teaching, and writing about the process of making, it has taught me that it is all about paying attention. In developing a practice, artists pay attention in particular ways and in a multitude of directions. Paying attention constitutes 90% of the curriculum of the studio. Slowing sight, speeding it up, seeing in between, seeing context, paying attention in turn to materials, their vibrant, layered, situated meanings, to context, society, and theory, to the critical, contextual, situated meanings that arise from the active practice of making, listening into one's interior and into what is exterior. How we pay attention matters. Paying attention can be practiced and honed. It is a verb. And it is the key to seeing clearly enough to make sense of things, inside and outside ourselves. The directed honing of attentiveness heightens embodied awareness and results in an altered experience of time. Chick-Man-Haley calls this flow. It takes the student beyond herself to attend to what is outside, but not other. It helps us see the world as an I-thou, rather than an I-it. Attention clears space for new knowledge to arrive and invests seeing with presence. Paying attention is really a way of trying to make sense of things. Artists are trying to figure out where it is that we have landed and just what on earth is going on in the world. Artists, after all, do not make art because we know something. We make art to figure things out. I often say to my students, pay attention into the interstices between your heart and where it is you have landed. What arises there is where you will find your work, your best work, situated within a lived context. In other words, as well as being a form of expression, art is a form of understanding, a situated, sense-making, sense-trusting, active practice. Mary Oliver's instructions for living a life pertains to everyone, not just artists. Pay attention. Be astonished. Tell about it. For Simone Weil, the World War II era philosopher, mystic, political activist, and religious thinker, attention was the pearl of great price. In her short essay on the proper use of school studies, Weil identifies attention as the primary capacity whose development and cultivation was the real reason why one studied anything. Why? Because prayer consists of attention, she wrote. Developing the ability to pay attention was preconditioned to being able to pray. For the writer Annie Dillard, attentiveness is the secret of seeing. Theologian Jacob Needham claims, I am my attention. For the polymath, psychiatrist, neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist, attention is, quote, nothing less than the way in which we relate to the world. What you find is a product of how you attend, McGilchrist says. He continues, attention is not just receptive, but actually actively creative of the world we inhabit. How we attend makes all the difference to the world we experience. How one pays attention can create and destroy and has the power to alter what it meets. Wow, that's an immense claim that I will come back to. Tech giants, of course, know this too and are in the race for your attention to harvest and to sell it. The attention economy has commodified the attention of billions of people, harnessing it towards economic ends. Knowing attention to be limited, scarce, and valuable, the technology is incentivized and optimized to capture attention. Attention has become a product. But Simone Weil had in mind a very different kind of attention, primarily an effort directed towards emptying one's mind. For Weil, attentiveness entails waiting intensely with heightened expectation and diminished self-consciousness and preoccupation. This attention carves out an absence in one's self-experience so that one can be filled with the presence of what one is attending to. To hone and extend one's capacity for attentiveness was for Weil a profoundly worthwhile and selfless act. The soul empties itself of all its own contents in order to receive into itself what it is looking at, just as it is in all its truth. Iris Murdoch thought paying attention in just this way constituted the first step in living a moral life. Recognizing that this is precisely the quality of attention that is cultivated in the studio, I came to formulate that art was an apophatic epistemology, a way of coming to knowing through trusting unknowing. Apophatic, of course, is a term borrowed from theology that refers to listening, centered prayer, emptying the mind of words and ideas to simply practice the presence of God. Recognizing that all we do not know about God, it is often referred to as negative theology. Cataphatic theology, on the other hand, is all about what we can say and know about God. Art enacts meaning and negotiates insight in materialized experiential rather than propositional language by plunging into the oceanic unknown, trusting the apophatic abyss, the liminal silent gap, by listening. Marina Abramovich advocates sitting in silence for 3 hours a day. Bill Viola goes on silent retreats to listen, filling notebooks with project inspiration. Made by an embodied maker, made manifest through the material experiential realm, and received through another body, art making depends on a web of culturally mediated, affective, sensory, and intellectual encounters, a complex web of relationships. It is a form of sense-making, or understanding, if you will, an epistemology of sorts. But since it entails launching into the unknown, an apophatic epistemology. Born of mindful attention, this apophatic epistemology listens and asks questions into the contested interstitial spaces between embodied awareness, sense perception, imagination and reason, enthusiasm, dream and disaster, affect, intuition and intellect, wordless, timeless experiences of unknowing, and those known through our embodied existence. Embodied, self-emptying attention, listening, is at the heart of the process. This is what releases energy to fuel the making. This is what is behind experiencing moments of being wide awake. By paying attention in this way, art becomes an active practice through which new knowledge arises. In The Holy Longing, Roland Rollhauser defines spirituality as an inner energy of fire. Aesthetics, then, is the shape we give to that energy. More than methodology, skill, theory, or concept, art is about receptive sense-making. An aesthetics opposite, aesthetics can be understood as an epistemology that wakes us up. This, in short, is behind the power of art. Artists create images, experiences, sounds that make sense, that suddenly crystallize what we had no words for previously. That image, the elephant in the room, remind what we have forgotten, reveal what was kept secret, that show the truth. Some call this creating new ontological tools. My PhD dissertation was entitled The Aesthetics of Attentiveness, and it describes how being attentive, often in apophatic ways, helps artists to see the world and themselves more clearly. So what is the cost of inattention? What is at risk if we refuse to pay attention or are sloppy, giving over our attention unconsciously, being unmindful of attention? While doing my doctoral program at SFU, I suffered a heart attack and a divorce, finally writing The Aesthetics of Attentiveness, a philosophy for artists and educators, about which my advisor commented that I was living my dissertation. My physical crisis was one cost of inattention. Sometime later, I was stopped again by reading Alana Mitchell's Seasick, The Global Ocean in Crisis, and woke up to the urgent ecological collapse that we are all implicated in. This stop was less of a physical stop and more of an existential stop. With this book, I realized the urgency of the global climate crisis and that the cost of inattention can be collective as well as personal. Twice, I was stopped and I was woken up, and through writing came to understand aesthetics in a new way. My question now is how to catalyze action, wake up the collective commons in response to the clear environmental stop that we are all experiencing. Because we can feel the change. Daily we hear about and experience extreme weather events, runaway wildfires, drought, flood, loss of cold, loss of habitat, loss of aquifers, loss of rivers, loss of species. But in the odd, slow, fast time of climate change, as Catherine Keller calls it, action seems suspended. Collectively, we have woken up in the Anthropocene, a term that marks how in 200 years, human activity has literally changed the chemistry of the planet. It is measurable, a matter of physics and chemistry. The ocean has acidified, warmed, lost oxygen, shifting jet streams and global climate cycles. The Industrial Revolution, fueled by a mechanistic view of the universe, has halted the fecundity of the Cenozoic era, inaugurating the sixth mass extinction. No one needs to be convinced of the urgency of our global environmental situation, or of the irony of Francis Bacon's conviction that nature could be conquered. René Descartes believed science would make humans masters, possessors, and dominators of nature. In retrospect, this sounds shocking in its arrogance. Understanding the implications of being a planetary geophysical force requires change, a radical reimagination of humanity's place in the whole scheme of things, what I call a kenotic turn. Geologian Thomas Berry calls it the most significant reorientation our species has ever had to face, a reorientation that poet Tim Lilburn suggests we lack the interior imaginative capacity to navigate. Given how clearly the signs and the sciences are showing us what is collectively emerging that can help us weather the coming storms. How can the arts be, as Martha Nussbaum asserts, a necessity? Psychiatrist, neuroscientist, polymath Ian McGilchrist shares a sense of urgency regarding the consequences of inattention. Quote, "There is an urgent need to transform both how we think of the world and what we make of ourselves, on which nothing less than our future depends," he writes. Bringing together neurology, physics, and philosophy, he calls for another way of attending to shape society. His work challenges the common assumption that the world is essentially mechanical and inert, nothing but a collection of things to use. The mechanistic paradigm remains our society's primary way of understanding the world, and it remains a vital way of attending. It is just that in isolation, it is insufficient. It remains essential, but it needs to be nested within a second way of paying attention. Following his 2009 The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, his massive 2-volume The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World was published in 2021. In meticulous detail, backed up by extensive brain research, for every point, McGilchrist describes how our brain functions. Divided into 2 halves, connected by the corpus callosum, the brain is a single, integrated, highly dynamic system of networks. The whole brain is used for everything. However, each hemisphere pays attention in entirely different ways towards entirely different ends. Quote, "The brain's left hemisphere is designed to help us apprehend and thus manipulate the world. The right hemisphere to comprehend it, see it, for what it is. Now here's the rub. To manipulate is not to understand. And the ability to simplify things in order to use mitigates against understanding the fullness and complexity, the reality of things. Power, which is ability without understanding, blinds. It can wreak havoc precisely because it does not understand. From the foreword to the matter with things. This book argues that we are wreaking havoc on ourselves and the world, and that if our best intentions lead to paradoxical outcomes, it is because we have become mesmerized by a mechanistic, reductionist way of thinking, the product of a brain system which evolved not to help us understand, but merely to manipulate the world, that of the left hemisphere. We have become blind to what the subtler, more intelligent, and more perceptive right hemisphere sees. Consequently, we no longer seem to have the faintest idea of who we are, what the world is, or how we relate to it. If we are to survive, and for our survival even to matter, we need to become aware of what is, at a fundamental level, the matter with things. All of the arts, poetry, an apprehension of the sacred, compassion, empathy, all rely heavily on what McGilchrist calls right hemisphere attention. Studio practices require, exercise, and hone precisely this kind of attention. So left and right are both entirely necessary. I hope you hear that. And both are honed in arts practices. But in addition to using left hemisphere attention, and unlike most disciplines in the academy, studio practices explicitly exercise, develop, and hone right hemisphere attention. The arts offer the how. They exercise right hemisphere attention and create the cognitive preconditions for something new to emerge. The hemispheres need each other and ideally nest together, passing information back and forth across the corpus callosum at least twice. McGilchrist accesses a mountain of neurological research to back up every assertion, citing exactly what happens when one hemisphere does not function. Neither on its own functions successfully, although the outcomes are actually worse with only the left hemisphere. Fair to say that in our society we do an excellent job cultivating the left hemisphere, not so much with the right. Left hemisphere excels in highly focused, deep silos of selective attention, local, narrow, analytical, and mechanical, linear attention. The right hemisphere is broad and global, flexible, open and curious, keen to learn without preconditions what exists. McGilchrist says, quote, "I argue that the reductionist paradigm has had a good run for its money, but the time is over. We need a new one." The left hemisphere loves to name, and then, in the interests of efficiency, moves on. Once it recognizes something, it drops the equivalent of a cognitive symbol in place. But to see clearly, we need to see beyond the obvious and stereotypical. Hence, one of the first practices in the studio is to sustain focus. This frustrates the left. The philosopher William James identified preperceptions as stored symbols which allow for easy, instant identification of objects or of knowledge, an inchoate or anticipatory awareness of something. A preperception is a stereotype, a prior mental image or expectation of what is to be perceived. They always simplify, often mislead, since they prevent us from taking the time to look carefully, to study, consider, or scrutinize till clarity is arrived at, to recognize something new. This is the naming function of the left hemisphere, and it's very helpful in helping us function. It names and goes on. But to draw, or to see clearly, or for something new to arise, one needs to shut down the internal naming voice to sustain focus over a longer time. The curriculum of Art 181 exercises sequentially, tracking week by week, right hemisphere attention. The very same outcomes that McGilchrist outlines in his work. So, As a way of demonstrating right hemisphere attention, let's take a look at this grayscale on the screen. Think about the little dot in the center of each of those value samples. Take a look at the top dot. Now take a look at the bottom dot. How would you compare them? Are they the same? How are they different? How would you describe them? Okay, so you are right if you thought the tone was the same. What has actually changed is the ground, not the tone of that little dot. It appears to change, but it actually doesn't. Seeing value and color is context determined. Tone appears to shift when it's surrounded by a different toned ground. The dark ground drains the dark, the white ground drains the light. So this used to be proof that our sensory perceptual system was unreliable, and that, as Descartes said, if we can be fooled once, perception is not something one can trust. But the problem is not with our sensory perception. The problem is with taking that little dot out of the context. Everything exists in a relational web. The issue is taking objects, things, data out of their context. That is what's wrong with the picture. Ian McGilchrist says, the only world that any of us can know then is what comes into being in the never-ending encounter between us and this whatever it is. What is more, I will claim that both parties evolved and are changed through the encounter. It is how we and it become more fully what we are. The process is both reciprocal and creative. Now this in-between, this notion of between us and whatever it is, in the studio we call that negative space. Negative spaces are generally ignored in Western society, but they're very important, vitally important in fact, to drawing realistically, which most beginning students desperately want to do. This in-betweenness called negative space is absolutely critical for us to comprehend. It's what the philosopher Wittgenstein talked about in terms of a shift in aspect. I often say to my students, artists make in the interstices between us, our hearts, and where we have landed, our context. And in that negative space between the two is where we make our best work. McGilchrist's work invites a kind of revolution of attention for our entire globe, parallel to how Descartes' insights fueled world-changing outcomes. This new revolution, one of care and compassion, empathy for the ecology, brings balance, harnesses attention in order to avert the crisis of inattention. Can the transdisciplinary nature and methodological complexity of contemporary material practices address the Anthropocene, change anything? Can embodied sensory perception, exercising haptic, emotional, intuitive, and tacit knowing, complicate and complete the thought constructs that Descartes' work inaugurated? Is it possible that reinstating sensory perception alongside reason knowing can balance the reductive influence of Descartes, re-enchant the academy, save the world? Can balancing percept with concept wake us up to what is happening in our common home? Can widening ways of knowing beyond the narrowly analytical possibly allow access to wicked problems such as global climate systems, change that causes urban engineered infrastructure to collapse? As vital as it is to measure the health of the planet with science, it is equally vital to reimagine and visualize our relations with it using art. Art making is necessary. McGilchrist thinks that rebalancing ways of attending is necessary for just this purpose. Thomas Berry used the aspirational term ecozoic to put aside anthropocentric in favor of biocentric norms of progress. He envisioned a society where every aspect of life, economics, education, science, is subordinate to ecology, or we will not survive. Learning intimacy with the earth and more than human others, it is time to wake up from a collective, anesthetized state of grief. We have been stopped. Maybe the arts can help us wake up. Adept at navigating uncertainty, one of the strengths of the arts is that its practitioners learn flexible purposing, comfort with unknowing, and how to transform stops into potential. Perhaps the arts can help us to give up the fantasy of inordinate control, develop a little ambiguity tolerance, learn, use right hemisphere attention in order to address the wicked problems that are not going away. Perhaps through the arts, we can establish intimacy with the earth, understand that we are embedded within the life systems of the planet, learn how to live on a damaged planet. Right hemisphere attention increases the potential for empathy and compassion. It sends the otherwise ego-driven self out, cultivates attention, fluidity of imagination, flexible purposing. Can we extend our subjectivities, learn a new way of attending, create new ontological tools? Artists are trained to condense and crystallize, draw on tacit knowledge, trust the intuition, scrutinize emotions, pay attention to sensory perception, lean into chaos. As McGilchrist demonstrates, right hemisphere attention allows us to see the whole gestalt. Waking up in the sixth extinction, can we imagine a new ending? As Simone Weil taught, perhaps attention is the pearl of great price. Borrowing from the last line of Dante's Inferno, by developing right hemisphere attention to balance left hemisphere attention, we can find a way out of the inferno and still see stars.